Well, good evening and welcome to this International Center for Moral Injury, or ICMI, webinar titled Moral Injury and its Negative Revelation, which is taken from the title of the monograph of our speaker, the Reverend Dr. Michael Yandell. My name is Brian Powers, and I have the honor of being the inaugural Bernard William Vann Fellow in Christianity and the Armed Forces here at Durham University, as well as the Executive Director of the ICMI. And I'm glad that each of you has joined us tonight. As you'll likely know, the International Center for Moral Injury is committed to producing and receiving scholarship on moral injury, facilitating new research by building networks of academic scholars, military officers, chaplains, clergy, and others with knowledge of and experience with moral injury. The ICMI seeks to create and develop resources for pastoral counselors, caregivers, churches, and faith organizations caring for morally injured individuals. Each of these things serves the center's ultimate goal of increasing an understanding of the causes and impacts of moral injury and facilitating increased care for those experiencing it. So, seeking to meet several of those aims, this is the first webinar in our monthly series, which will focus on moral injury in different forms, from different angles, and certainly from different perspectives. While dependent, of course, on the consent of our speakers, our aim is to have all of our webinars recorded and up on our website. And we would note that our launch webinar from November, which featured a good introduction to the ICMI and its aims, may currently be found on our website as well. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this evening. The Reverend Dr. Michael Yandell is a graduate of Bright Divinity School and completed his PhD in theological studies at Emory University with a concentration in religion, conflict, and peace building. He's a veteran of the U.S. Army, serving as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist from 2002 to 2006, deploying to Iraq in 2004. He's published several articles in both academic and ecclesial journals on moral injury, and has recently served as co-chair of the American Academy of Religion's Moral Injury and Recovery in Religion and Society unit. His book, which is hot off the press and available now from Lexington Press, is titled War and Negative Revelation, a Theoethical Reflection on Moral Injury. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Michael Yandell. Michael?
I want to say I feel very honored to be asked to present on my work, and I'm just grateful to you all for joining in on the Zoom, spending your precious time with me today. I had to, in preparation for this, kind of reread my own book. And many times I was like, did I write this? I don't know if any of you have ever experienced kind of a long academic exercise. You can lose yourself in it at points, and then when you put it aside, it feels fully other to you. But there's a part of the book that I feel very present in still, and that's the preface, and it's the part most people comment on. I don't know if they just get tired out by the time the book starts, but the preface is where I sort of tell my story a little bit, and every word still rings true as I reread it. It was difficult to write, but I do feel it's one of my best pieces of writing. It's because it's the most honest. The rest of the book is honest, but just comes from a different vantage point. Brian, in preparation for this, asked me to speak a little bit in regard to the preface and what it meant for me to become comfortable being able to speak about my own experience in the war and be able to speak openly about moral injury. And that was a long journey for me. And I'll say it began in a bizarre circumstance in that I began my theological education at Bright Divinity School the same year that Rita Nakashima Brock arrived at Bright Divinity School to launch her Soul Repair Center. And they were doing an event where they had 4 veterans speak on a panel. She learned that I was a veteran of the war and asked me to speak. And I had never spoken at all in public about the war. Soldiers are encouraged not to do that, and my field was especially warned not to speak to the press or speak in public due to the nature of the work. So I struggled with that. I struggled with being able to say a word of truth about myself and my experience. But since then, I've found that speaking from my experiences is very empowering, as I imagine it's very empowering for most people who've experienced any kind of trauma to be able to find words and agency and name something out loud. I don't pretend to know the experiences of those who've become part of the Me Too movement, but I liken that power that comes from just naming something to something parallel in my own experience of being able to speak about war and trauma there. What happened for me when I was beginning to speak about my experience is that I felt I was able to come back to life in a way. I had become sort of a trope of a person in my own mind, in my own spirit, because when I left the Army, I felt like my story dropped out of the Army. And what I mean by that is what had happened to me, who I had become, no longer fit into the narrative of what it meant to be a soldier. And I felt like a trope of a broken soldier, of a person who is now on the outside and just no longer part of the story. And I was thinking today about Han Solo. We all know that objectively, The Empire Strikes Back is the best Star Wars film out of all of them. I think we can all agree. At the end of The Empire Strikes Back, Han Solo is frozen, as you know, in carbonite with a grimace on his face. And that's how I feel that trauma often works, and moral injury, especially, one gets frozen into an image, a false image, a trope, a stereotype, a simulacrum, a non-person. And to be able to speak is to come out of that image and step back into personhood. And my most powerful moment for me was publishing in that preface a truth about me that I'd carried around for a long time, that while I was still in the Army, I was hospitalized after harming myself intentionally. I was suicidal. I was deemed a high risk for self-abuse and labeled officially as unfit for duty. And at that time in my life, that felt like the end, a death sentence almost, to be unfit for duty, because my whole life at that point was sort of defined by being a soldier. And to be unfit meant I couldn't be that anymore. So what was I? Kind of frozen in carbonite, I guess, cast aside, no longer of any matter of importance to the empire. I recall this cadence I heard at Fort Hood after I'd been hospitalized. And soldiers running by singing this, somebody's not going to make it, their poor little heart can't take it, or running cadence. And I remember having sung that cadence in the past while I was running with other soldiers. And I remember being in civilian clothes in Fort Hood, lined up with psychiatric appointments, feeling like I was very much on the outside, that I was one whose heart couldn't take it. And those were soldiers who were fit, who were part of the story, and I was now excised and on the outside. As the years went by, though, I discovered, came to recognize that the place of being unfit for duty, is a place where one can still tell the truth. And one can still tell a story that is part of the story. And in telling my story, I hoped that I could point out things in the grander narrative that aren't often seen. And by telling my story, I hope that others who knew those unseen things might feel empowered to do the same thing. And so for all the academic language, which I feel is very important in my book, that's the part that matters most to me, is being able to speak truth and hoping that others will connect to it and feel empowered to speak another truth in their own language that doesn't have to be in the field of Christian theology, ethics, or academic language at all. Coincidentally, I am a full-time minister now, and Sunday's lectionary text is the Beatitudes, my favorite words of Jesus. And he says stuff from a liminal space, almost a space like being unfit. He starts saying stuff like, blessed are the poor, blessed are the people who mourn, blessed are the people who hunger and thirst. And on its face, that's kind of nonsense. That to me doesn't match up with the experience of being poor, of mourning, of grieving, of hungering for righteousness, being a peacemaker. But to speak the blessing from this liminal space, to be able to say, blessed are those, there's a power in that. Even if it doesn't make the empire crumble, those are words of truth and power. And without them, the story wouldn't be complete. So, an aside, as a clergy person, the Beatitudes have been on my mind in preparation for this. A key concept in my book is anti-life. It took me a long time to arrive at that particular hyphenated word. And my effort was to find something, name something as clearly as I could. I wanted to shine a light on the global war on terror and the logic undergirding it, its disregard for authentic life. And I wanted to say it as potently as possible. And anti-life is what I came up with. And there's plenty of other words we might use. but that's the word I chose. And I rooted it in the thought of an ancient Christian theologian named Origen. And just a key phrase of his, he talks about goodness and justice. And his theological opponents at the time, he said that they treated goodness and justice as almost two separate things, that goodness was treating good with good. So to treat the good with good, but then to treat evil with evil, that was justice. And he describes that concept of justice, to do evil unto evil, as a kind of hatred. And that is really a degraded view of justice, a false view of justice, because goodness and justice, he would argue, are one and the same. They're one and the same. And so we can't be doing evil over here and calling it justice, and doing good to the people we deem good over here and calling it goodness. Hatred is hidden in that kind of justice. That's what's veiled, what's in the shadows. And so when I use this phrase, negative revelation, that's in the title of my book, what I'm really trying to illuminate is that there is a hatred that's hidden in justice, in the way we conceive of justice, especially as a nation here in the US, waging these 20 wars of a global effort against terrorism. There's a hatred that's concealed. And so the negative revelation then isn't discovering necessarily a precise positive content to what goodness is. The revelation is ripping that false word justice off of the hatred that's hidden within it. There's a lot more I could say about that. I will nod in the direction of one of my favorite theologians, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who talks about evil masquerading as goodness. A famous phrase says that evil has appeared in the form of light in Nazi Germany. It says the basest contempt for humanity carries on its sinister business under the most holy assertions of love for humanity. And that is how I liken George Bush's comments on the eve of September 11th. And I don't mean to say that George Bush was evil, some sinister being lurking in the shadows. I don't mean to say that at all. George Bush is a complicated whole person, just like every other person. But he made remarks that night that we were going to go forward and defend all that's good and just in our world. And to me, that set in motion 20 years worth of an abomination, really, a misguided attempt to define goodness and justice. There was an assumption there that when we fought, by default in our fighting, we were on the side of goodness and justice. It was evil in the form of light, not in his remarks and not in everything that came from those remarks, but those were the holy assertions under which all sorts of travesties and hatred, crimes would be committed. All that's good and just. This was the veil sort of could contain so much hatred, so much violence. I spend a good deal of time, maybe too much time in the book, writing about Donald Rumsfeld. And you might ask, why Donald Rumsfeld? And sometimes I ask myself that. I think the main reason I spend time with Donald Rumsfeld is because, in my memory, he was the face to the war. In hindsight, I think the people that fall under the most critique are Bush and then really Dick Cheney. And I see that it's kind of low-hanging fruit, and they've kind of been villainized to the point where it's not really worth beating that dead horse. There's much we could say about Bush and Cheney, but I thought of Rumsfeld as the spokesperson for the war, the image of the war, really. I think he enjoyed his time in front of the press, especially when the war was very popular. And I do always try to remind people that there was a good chunk of the time where the war was very popular on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, here in the United States. There was vast support for the Iraq War. And while there are some protests from the public, by huge margins, the Iraq War, I'd say, was a popular adventure. And so I think Rumsfeld sort of enjoyed his time answering questions and doing his karate chops, shooting down points and making arguments in front of the camera. And I've also come to respect him, and I'm loath to admit it. I read too much about him, and I read too much about what he wrote about himself, but he is a complex thinker, a smart person. I think we know that smart people can do a lot of damage, but I became convinced the more I studied Donald Rumsfeld that he really did want to do the just and the good, defend freedom, and all the catchphrases of the war. And he's an almost tragic figure in my eyes as one who's so intelligent and yet succumbed, in my view, to profound self-deception. Never, ever, even to the end of his life, admitting that the war was wrong, just defending over and over and over again that there could have been weapons of mass destruction. Like I found on one page in an autobiography where he talks about making mistakes, but as far as the war in general, he defended to his last breath. I do want to remind you of a famous saying of Donald Rumsfeld, the one that I never get tired of. Kind of genius, really. His little 3-point sermon almost. He'd say, as we know, there are known knowns. Things that we know, we know. And we also know that there are known unknowns. That is, things we know we don't know. But then there are also unknown unknowns. Those things that we don't know, we don't know. As a scholar, as an academic, I can just follow that rabbit hole for days. This kind of epistemological statement that just came out of nowhere when he was speaking to the press. He said all this when a reporter was challenging him about the existence of weapons of mass destruction. And that was basically his defense, that there are unknown unknowns. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know that they're not there just because we can't see them. One could make the same circular argument for the existence of God as a being if you wanted to go down that route. And it's an argument that goes nowhere. I mention that because that is how I see the logic of the global war on terror. You've got the known knowns, which give people like Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense at the time a warm, fuzzy feeling. We know them, locked in. And I think it's good for a Secretary of Defense to have known knowns. I would hope that they do know some things and know they know them. But then these known unknowns and unknown unknowns, the logic of the global war on terror was an effort, and I would say our foreign policy for a long time and still currently, is to make all of that known. It's to exhaust everything, to categorize everything. Is it a threat? Is it not a threat? Will this person become a threat? Can this person become radicalized? Is this person a terrorist? Might they help a terrorist? Can we freeze this person in carbonite, put them in Guantanamo Bay? Can we do this and not anger the American people? It's this system, this unfolding system of trying to see the entire globe, everything and everyone in it, from the point of view of American sovereignty. Everything known, everything in its place, with crystal clarity. Rumsfeld later added to his categories the unknown knowns. This would be the fourth combination of words. Unknown knowns are the things, he said, that you think you know, but it turns out you did not know. And that's pretty much what I'm saying about anti-life. We thought we knew what goodness and justice were. Turns out we didn't know. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way, also a helpful way to think about unknown knowns, things we think we know, but turns out we did not, is to think about it as self-deception, something I think Donald Rumsfeld fell victim to. And he is now deceased, and I want to honor that. Can't really stick up for himself anymore. But I believe he fell victim to a profound self-deception. Because if you ever look back to his time as a congressman or his first time as a Secretary of Defense, he's the only person who's ever served as Secretary of Defense twice. But his time with Gerald Ford, he wrote about the war in Vietnam in memos. He put everything in memos. He also speculated about what it would be like to get engaged in the Middle East as a U.S. military project. And he described it as a swamp, a quagmire. And he listed all these reasons that it would be. And they're all pretty accurate. And then later, in the early 2000s, it's as if he didn't know any of that. And he had written. And the press would ask him, are we in a quagmire? And he would get irate. No, we're not in a quagmire. As if to say, we know exactly what we're doing. We're making it all known. When you try to make everything known and everything fit. The experience of that all falling apart is devastating. There's nothing left. It's like the rug is pulled out from under you. That's how I think of moral injury. It's often described as one sort of overstepping one's own ethics, doing something that someone's been taught, held values about, that this is wrong, it shouldn't happen, you shouldn't kill, and yet you've killed. It's this betrayal of one's own values. And that's a helpful way to describe moral injury. But I also think of it, I try to push it much further than that it's not just about the self betraying some value. It's about values that were structured before the self was ever involved in a toxic way. The system of making everything known, the war convention, the way we distinguish between murder and killing. See, for example, Thomas Aquinas, all these great Christian theologians who've done this for hundreds of years. There's reams and reams of paper that nice, neatly build this vast convention, this vast morality about how we ought to think about war, killing, murder versus defense. And so long as you can stay part of that story, you're okay, you fit. But as soon as you see that it doesn't really make sense, and all the known knowns don't hold true, it all falls apart. I realized that goodness and justice itself, as they're conceived, as ethicists talk about them, as writers about war talk about them, as philosophers and theologians talk about them, goodness and justice themselves, they weren't what we thought they were. They weren't what I thought. And then there's nowhere to turn. Because every description of what's good and just in our world, as Bush would say, every description of freedom has been compromised and poisoned by this war system. And where does one turn then for goodness and justice? Negative revelation, as I work through it in the book, is me trying to admit and trying to push the question that goodness and justice aren't known. They will never be known knowns. They will remain known unknown at best. That we know that we can at least long for something that's not anti-life. But there's not positive content. And by positive content, I mean something we could point out and say, this is what it is. Because to do so would be to use that same logic that seeks to exhaust all mystery, to define and categorize everything to the point in which you make something that's living and organic and relational, the good and the just, into something static, parasitic, that freezes life into carbonite or Han Solo. And so negative revelation is to me putting aside, rejecting the hatred that's hidden under our framework of goodness and justice, but not trying to just redefine it again, but to be open to a mystery. In theological terms, in Christian theology, we'd use words cataphatic and apophatic. And the more I'm away from the academy, the more exhausted I am by terms like these. But cataphatic theology would be theology that names things, say, about God. God is love, God is good, God is all powerful, etc., etc. You name these qualities of God. Apophatic theology then is a theology of negation. You get at something by saying what it's not. So you might rule out, say that God is evil or intends harm or punishes for eternity. You might rule out that God has limits, etc., etc. And so you start fashioning things that make sense without ever having a positive content. You have more of a silhouette, something that's a mystery that you could still long for and desire that's not totally revealed. In the last chapter of my book, I draw a lot on Emmanuel Levinas. I find perennially difficult to understand, difficult to read. But briefly, Levinas really emphasized the face of the other, which sounds pretty simple, but in his philosophy it gets pretty complicated. But for me, that face of the other, if we let other be other, then to face the other, we have to let ourselves be called into question. Our own knowing, our own instinct maybe to make things known. That subsumes everything into the I. To be relational is to exist as an I, as a subject, without ever breaking into the other. The other remains other. That is allowing room for mystery and for life. Life to be dynamic, mysterious, and not frozen in carbonite. And that's to take a risk. To welcome the other welcomes mystery. And it also makes folks like Rumsfeld very uncomfortable, I would assume. It puts aside a desire for sovereignty, a sovereignty that even if you exist out there, I still know exactly what you are, whether or not you're a threat to my ability to rule over my own house. People don't want to risk sovereignty or letting go of sovereignty. But in order for goodness and justice to have meaning, by meaning, I say to remain mystery, that conception of sovereignty has to be let go. You have to be able to welcome mystery. So I guess I'm almost arguing in my work for relativistic ethics with people would poo-poo that. But a relational ethics, I suppose, an ethics that's always living. Goodness and justice, I think I'm arguing throughout my work, are never abstract, can never be abstracted into the kind of musings of Donald Rumsfeld as known, unknown, unknown, known, and so forth. Goodness and justice have to be grounded in relationship, in time, and in mystery. They don't remain the same, and they are born in a moment of self and other. And without that point of contact, goodness and justice so easily become co-opted as just another tool to hate the other and to assimilate the other into something false, something that betrays what the other is, and something that freezes them into carbonite, like our hero Han Solo. And I think with that, it's right at 2:45, and I hope some of that has been clear and helpful. And I hope if you're interested, you will grab my book. It's an obscene price. I probably wouldn't have a copy if I didn't get one for free, but you can at least request your library to order a copy. So thanks for the time.
As we conclude our webinar, then I just want to thank everyone for being with us. Certainly, primarily to the Reverend Dr. Michael Yandell. Thank you so much, Michael, for being with us, sharing with us, being so open with us. Thank you all who participated for the wonderful questions that really made this Q&A section easy, a delight, and very insightful. Also, just want to set a reminder as we close that our final webinar, or not our final webinar, excuse me, we have many more of these to come. Our next webinar will be on the 28th of February at 7 p.m., the same time as this one. We will again be inviting Brad Kelly and Christopher Tidd to comment and have a discussion on the power of ritual in engaging moral injury. And I do hope you'll visit our website and register to be there with us next month. And I will see you then and wish you all a good night.